James Carreras, who is the managing director of Hammer, was keen to promote to the British trade magazines that the double bill of Scars of Dracula and Horror of Frankenstein were going to be the first wholly 100% British funded Hammer films. Up until this point, Hammer had relied very heavily, if not entirely in some cases, on American funding. And that has started to dry up, not just for Hammer, but right across the board for British productions. And Carreras struck a deal with Bernard Delfont, who was running Associated British Picture Corporation, which had recently been bought out by EMI. And they wanted a fairly traditional Hammer double bill, Dracula, Frankenstein, and they offered to put up a budget of £200,000 per film.
And of course, in his usual tub-thumping way, James Carreras goes into the trade press announcing that, effectively Hammer is running as usual, no change, everything is marvellous, we're making these two films for EMI. Of course, this is nonsense. The fact that they no longer have American finance is, as any fool would realise, a disaster. And indeed, behind the scenes, while making these deals, James Carreras is looking for a way to get out of Hammer, and effectively, by the end of 1970, he has got out.
Christopher Lee's back as Dracula, and as with previous films in the series, it wasn't entirely a given that he would come back. There was a lot of negotiations involved to get him to return to the role. And he wrote a letter to his fan club suggesting that the reason there was a lack of continuity between the previous titles and Scars of Dracula is that Hammer were perhaps thinking about recasting, and this would be an easy way to actually reboot the whole series with an entirely new origin story.
Another possible indicator that Hammer were after casting a new actor as Dracula is provided by Tom Chantrell's pre-production artwork for Scars of Dracula. Because Chantrell obviously was unclear who was going to play Dracula in this. There was a sort of Christopher Lee-like image up at the top, but down below the real focus was this unidentifiable, sexy, younger model, as it were.
Scars of Dracula is Christopher Lee's fourth outing in the role of Count Dracula, and he certainly plays it differently on this occasion. He has far more dialogue, for one thing. It's an odd portrayal which he's never really had to give previously, where he seems to be trying to convince his visitors to remain there.
Before the castle was destroyed, strangers were always welcome. Please be seated. While your room is being prepared, we will take some wine.
And this is an element of Dracula we've not seen before. I'm not sure it's necessarily the most positive of elements, but it's certainly a new complexion.
He's slightly back to being that sort of urbane figure, that urbane count figure of the original 1958 horror Dracula. And it's quite remarkable that Christopher Lee is prepared to do this, because he's actually refused point blank to speak very much in the previous few films.
I'm afraid Christopher Lee takes everything very seriously, and when there were some giggles, like me, I'm a bit of a giggler, the bat near the end coming in to grab the cross from around my neck obviously comes in, hits your chest and bounces off backwards. Now, that's amusing. I'm sorry, Christopher, that is funny. But Christopher actually takes it very seriously indeed and says, you do realise this is a true person, Vlad the Impaler, and gave us all lectures and things. But generally, we kept him off the set when giggles were apt to happen.
Christopher Lee's makeup is substantially different. He is much paler. There are certain scenes where he looks positively unwell, as opposed to undead. But there are some positives with the makeup as well. The fangs, they look markedly different to previous representations. He also seems more able to speak with them in. And also the eyes, the contact lenses are beautifully made, and Christopher Lee knows precisely how to utilise them.
The two young leads are played by Dennis Waterman and Jenny Hanley, both of who would go on to become household names on British television in the next few years.
No, Simon, no. This is the first real clue we've had. We'll follow it together. I'm not leaving you.
My character was a rather fey, innocent, sweet girl, boring as hell, bless her. But she wafted her way through the whole thing and fainted on cue and got her chest ripped at the right time and won through to the end.
Waterman had already appeared for Hammer before in Pirates of Blood River and in an episode of Journey to the Unknown. He doesn't seem to have been much of a fan of Scars of Dracula. He didn't seem to have an awful lot of nice things to say about it.
Even though Dennis Waterman and I didn't get on because he hated apparently tall, blonde, posh bints, we became friends during the filming. And Roy Ward Baker, or Roy Baker as he called himself for directing that film, decided in his wisdom to do the kissing scene in the first week. Not good. Not good at all. You hardly know your fellow actors and all of a sudden you're having to do smooching scenes. And anyway, we got on in the end.
I think Jenny Hanley is just lovely in the role. She portrays that wide-eyed innocence that one wants from a vampire's victim in a Hammer film. She looks just perfect. It's a great pity that she's been dubbed by Nicky Vandensil. I don't understand why that would have been necessary, because Jenny Hanley is a good actress and certainly speaks the language.
And I went to see it with a friend who said, well, it's not your voice. And I'd been dubbed because apparently my voice was too low, too competent, and the girl was more airy-fairy, and she did sound like an absolute twerp, I have to say. But it was good for her character, I suppose. The screams were mine, and I have since seen a copy where my voice is there. You have to have Michael Ripper in a Hammer film or it's not the real McCoy. It's like Hitchcock. If he's not in the film, it's obviously something different. And he was wonderful in it. Patrick Troughton, a wonderful Doctor Who, but a marvellous Clove. So evil, so twisted, and what a giggler.
You must get away too. Now, take her with you. You'll do terrible things to her if you don't.
You wouldn't normally expect an actor, I think, of Troughton's stature to be doing a role like this. You'd expect to find an actor of Troughton's stature to play, for example, the priest, you know, the Michael Gwynne role. Or, you know, you might even expect someone like Troughton to have played Baron Frankenstein for Hammer. You know, he is of that quality and he is of that league. And yet he does, because he's been put in this slightly unusual part, he makes an awful lot out of it, I think, and he does actually invest Clove with an awful lot more interest than might have been in lesser hands.
The director assigned to Scars of Dracula was Roy Ward Baker, who had already made for Hammer Quatermass and the Pit, and just a couple of months previously, actually, The Vampire Lovers, made at the beginning of 1970. For reasons of his own, Baker considered neither Quatermass and the Pit nor The Vampire Lovers to be traditional horror films. He felt that Scars of Dracula was his entree into full-blooded Gothic horror, and he decided to take that full-blooded idea quite literally.
Director Roy Ward Baker went back to the novel when he started shooting Scars of Dracula, and one of the things he liked most about the book was the scene of Dracula in the novel crawling down the walls of Castle Dracula, and he put that in the film. He's now crawling up the wall of Castle Dracula, but that was the first time we'd ever seen that on the big screen.
Roy Ward Baker was a gentleman, an absolute sweetie. He cared about the characters and gave everybody the time to show their character. And he gave us direction. He didn't just say, you know, run from there to there. He said, stand over there and hold your breath till I tell you, and then run forward. And you think, but I'm going to be, oh yes, I'm going to be out of breath. Good point. And that was part of Roy. He loved the whole industry and loved directing. Aida Young, who was our producer, was a very, very special lady. She was devoted. I was trying to find the right word, and that is the right word. If she liked you and she knew that you were right, she would walk on water for you, make sure that you got that part, because she knew that she had what she wanted, and therefore, if she was right, that would make it right for everybody else. I'm not saying she was bombastic, although other people might. But she was a good friend to have, and she got me a lot of work, a lot of work.
James Carreras maintained to the trade papers that The Horror of Frankenstein and Scars of Dracula had been allotted 200 grand each. I wonder if that was a slight exaggeration. They don't look like 200 grand films to me. There are some budgetary limitations to be dealt with. Scars of Dracula, they get around this to an extent by the fact that the villagers have indeed burned the castle in the prologue to the film. But even in the prologue to the film, the castle exterior set is somewhat limited, not very convincing. Another budgetary shortcoming of the film, Roger Dickens' bat, or I should say bats, because there are fleets of the damn things. And in fact, Hammer appear to have been rather proud of them. The bat or bats are effectively made to seem like the stars of the film in the film's trailer. I can't help feeling that Roger Dickens, had he been given a little bit more money, would have been able to make more convincing bats, because after all, he had been one half of the team that did the effects for Hammer's When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth, which any moment now was going to be, he and Jim Danforth were going to be nominated for an Oscar for his work on that. And of course by 1978 he was doing remarkable work on Alien.
Hammer don't so much as have a turnaround as have a half turnaround. So half the sets that were used in the film before are then reused in the next film. And we had, I think it's the same bed that we had, and we had all sorts of the same things. And the other thing that they ask you is whether you can add things that you have at home that would be free, like shoes or jewellery. And they asked me if I had a cross. And I said yes. And they said, well, is it big enough to be seen on film? And I said yes. And this is my cross, which I used in the film, and luckily they let me keep, because they said, oh no, it's continuity. I said, but it wouldn't be worn unless I was wearing it. So I got to keep my cross, thank goodness.
James Bernard's score for Scars of Dracula is particularly impressive. It's beautifully melodic, it's lyrical. Ida Young, the producer, had asked Bernard if he could produce something that was less discordant, less difficult to manage musically. And he went away to think about this. But in the same process, Bernard had said on a number of occasions in interviews that if Hammer were particularly concerned about a property, they asked him to really ramp up the score and to try and provide additional drama that perhaps the visuals or the script were unable to. And I think that this is possibly one of those examples.
By Hammer standards, Scars of Dracula is an extremely bloody film. Suddenly you've got sort of well choreographed sequences of bat attacks. You know, it opens basically with a scene where all the women folk in a village are attacked by a horde of bats. Their faces are clawed to pieces. You see close-ups of body parts and God knows what else. Later on in the film, you have Dracula taking up stabbing a female vampire to death. In the original cut, he then proceeds to suck at her bloody wounds, which was later removed by the BVFC. But all of this is because suddenly, on the 1st of July 1970, the X certificate changes. The British Board of Film Censors alter the certification. So for the first time ever, whereas the X certificate before forbade people from 16 and under from seeing a Hammer film, suddenly it becomes 18 and under. So that frees Hammer to do some quite nasty stuff for the first time.
And I think this is most clearly represented by the attack upon Jenny Hanley by the vampire bat, when the bat drags off the crucifix around her neck. And it's clearly seen that in the attack, her breasts have become bitten and scratched. And there is blood in her breasts, and this is something that Hammer has never portrayed previously. John Trevelyan of the British Board of Film Censors had said that this was a dangerous cocktail, the mixing of horror and sexuality, something that should never happen, and the idea of blood on breasts should not happen on film.
Scars of Dracula is a film that seems internally rather confused about what it's meant to be. There's a scene early on where Delia Lindsay, as the burgomaster's daughter, is caught effectively in flagrante by her father, who is played by the Benny Hill veteran Bob Todd. Pier end humour of a very uninspired kind, I'm afraid, much as I love Bob Todd personally. And yet, you know, that kind of scene coexists in a film where Christopher Lee is on typically fine form and has some of his most interesting moments actually when biting his victims. He bites Anushka Hempel in a wonderfully feral scene. And then he bites Wendy Hamilton, and again we have a wonderful close-up of his eyes while doing so, and his dead eyes just flicker up and break the fourth wall effectively and look directly at us. And I think one of the great moments where Lee expressed the loneliness of evil. But in a way, he was expressing this in a film that is really unsure of what it ought to be.
Scars of Dracula was without doubt the most violent of the Hammer Dracula films. Director Roy Ward Baker set out with the aim to make it, in his words, horrible. And I think he succeeded admirably in that, although I think possibly to the film's detriment.
For the first time since 1970, about 4 years ago, at a convention, and I didn't want to sort of sit in the audience, so I sort of stood at the back and tried to pretend I wasn't there. And I actually got into it. I thought it was a very good film.
It is your no frills, no messing Dracula film, and you can imagine actually that as part of a double bill for a mainstream audience, you know, going down to the local ABC to go and see a double bill, it does actually work pretty well. It may not be a horror connoisseur's favourite, but actually in terms of like a straight down the line Dracula film, I think it ticks all the right boxes.